Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude. Today reviewing this Kingston Arms Type 13A War Sword or Great Sword of War. Now, this sword sells new at a variety of prices depending on where you would buy it. It is distributed by XIIIa. Kingston Arms is kind of a sister brand to Hanwei, and they're both under the XIIIa umbrella. And there's quite a few resellers for XIIIa. The best price that I found recently for this sword is from Kult of Athena at $310. I will put a link in the description to that where you can buy it from Kult of Athena. Know that it is an affiliate link. I do get a small referral bonus if you buy through that link. Now, it's important for me to say that this is not the default Kingston Arms Type 13A. I have had the edge sharpened and the grip rewrapped, and I'll get into more details about that in the appropriate sections. This was not a new sword when it came to me, but it was essentially new. I bought it secondhand, but the person who I bought it from had just received it new and then decided they didn't want to keep it, and I bought it from them. So it wasn't fully new from them, but it was basically essentially new. This sword, along with several others that Kingston Arms offers, was designed by Angus Trim for Kingston Arms to make. So that sets a pretty high bar for expectations because Gus Trim's swords have a very unique feel to them. And there's a reason his swords are so popular at cutting tournaments. It's because they handle great, they cut great. So being able to get a sword that was designed by him at the very budget-oriented price of around $300, that's a really appealing prospect for people who can't afford his swords directly from him. His swords start at around $1,000 pretty much bare minimum. So this is a much cheaper way of getting a sword that is designed by him. How well does Kingston Arms live up to that? Well, let's find out. Now, the term Great Sword of War comes from historical sources, and these types of large, powerful swords were kind of the first swords that were designed in the medieval period for two-handed use. They were still designed to be able to be used one-handed, but at the time, armor had developed enough that it was less important for people to use a shield if they had full armor. So they could then use their offhand on a bigger, more powerful sword. Now, there were, generally speaking, what we see as Great Swords of War are the Oakshott types 12A and 13A. This is the 13A. They are relatively similar swords, but there are differences. The 13A is going to be a broader sword, have less profile taper, and be a little bit more cut focused, whereas the 12A with a bit more acute of a point and more profile taper is a little bit more thrust focused. We're not talking big differences here, but those are the primary differences between a 12A and a 13A. And these types of swords saw their prominence rise in the high medieval period, that is the 13th and 14th centuries. That's a long time for a type of sword to be in use. Oftentimes, especially towards later medieval periods, you started seeing a lot more changes to sword design in shorter periods of time. The 13th and 14th century show that these swords were used a lot and they remained popular for quite some time. In fact, some of the later medieval and early Renaissance swords kind of came back to this style of blade, of a more cut-focused blade than some of the more thrust-focused of those later periods. So the sword does come with a scabbard that has kind of this leather throat on it, leather covering, and then some kind of ferrous chape, probably a stainless steel. And the chape is pinned into the scabbard core. I don't think this construction is historical, but I am not in the least a scabbard expert, so don't take my word for that, really. Looking down into the scabbard, it's really hard to tell if this is wood core or not. The surface here is kind of like got a thick layer of what looks like paint or something like that. So you can't really see the material that well. And it's very possible that it's not actual wood core. I know, Kingston Arms is kind of a sister brand to Hanway, and some of the Hanway budget scabbards are not made from wood. They're made from more modern material. Don't know if that's the case here, but overall, it feels pretty sturdy. Doing this, it doesn't really sound like wood, but I don't know for sure. It doesn't really matter to me at this price point. Getting a scabbard that is not just a leather sheath, or getting anything that really is a good deal. So the fact that it comes with it and it's functional, that's not a bad deal. Now I did manage to scrape up the scabbard a little bit here. That's my fault from when I was pulling it out of my sword rack and I scraped it against another sword. So don't hold that against Kingston Arms. The fit of the scabbard is actually quite nice. It slides in nicely. There's a little bit of rattle, but not a lot of rattle. If I hold it upside down, it doesn't come out at all. I have to actually pull it out. Let's see about if I flip the scabbard around. It's a little more rattle this way, that's for sure. So it's a little looser fitting here, and it actually does slide out. So there is definitely one side that fits a little bit better than the other. But still, that is not a bad fit at all. Let's take a look at the hilt of this sword, starting with the pommel. This is a type H pommel, and as is very common with A-trim designs, the pommel is kind of small for the size of the sword. It's not comically small or anything like that, but it is a smaller, lighter pommel. That is something that Angus Trim does on most of his swords that he makes himself, and it has continued through into this design that he did. I would assume part of the extra weight that you would normally get from a bigger pommel is probably in the tang. It probably is a little bit beefier of a tang because the crossguard is not particularly big either. But this pommel has this kind of brushed, or maybe actually a tumbled look to it that I think this is stainless steel. This is a very common look on Kingston Arms hilt furniture. It's a modern look, but I like it. I think it's something different than the satin that you see everywhere. And this is also going to hide scuffs quite well, I think. Now, unlike a lot of the swords I review, the higher end swords I review, there's not a ton of geometry to this pommel. It's pretty much one thickness throughout. There's no taper anywhere here, but it's not a big deal. This is, again, a hallmark of Angus Trim swords. He doesn't really do that on his pommels either. And it's kind of something you're going to get, going in, buying from a sword from Angus Trim or one that he designed. Or at least if you don't, you'll find out about that. Would it be nice to see it have a little bit more geometry? Sure. Is it required? No, especially on a more budget-oriented piece, which this sword most certainly is. Now, the slightly raised boss, this is very slightly raised boss here, is very smoothed over. There is absolutely no chance of a hot spot from this raised boss, and the corners here are all very nicely chamfered as well, so no real hot spots anywhere on this pommel. Now, it is also not peened to the tang. You can see it is a hex nut construction. Some people like that, some people don't. It is certainly not historical, but it does work well, and what it does let you do is, if this comes loose, you can put an Allen wrench in there, crank it down, and very quickly get it nice and tight again. In fact, this pommel has come loose once. I'll talk about that more a little bit later. Let's talk about the crossguard. This is a Type 7 crossguard is what I would call it, with a very slight upswept nature to it. You will probably notice that the quillins are not symmetrical. This one does not have the same upsweep to it. That is not Kingston Arms' fault. This sword, when I bought it secondhand and when I got it, the shipping company had been incredibly rough with the sword, and the quillin came bent more. It was bent back a little bit more than this. So I took it on advice from a couple other sword makers. I clamped the quillin down and just gave it some very slight, not gentle, but steady pressure to bend it back a little bit to shape. I didn't get it all the way. You can definitely see it is not fully correct now, but I think I got it close enough for my taste. This to me looks like, actually makes it look a little more accurate to medieval people because they did not have, perfect symmetry. So this doesn't bother me. Now I could probably do some more bending, especially if I decide to disassemble the entire thing, but I didn't want to put too much stress on the steel. So I left it like this. I think it's good enough. Just like the pommel, the guard here has kind of that tumbled look to it, and I believe it is stainless steel as well. There's a bit more of some grind lines in a few spots visible, but not too bad. And just like the pommel, everything has been chamfered over beautifully. There is no chance of a hot spot anywhere here. If we look at the gap in the guard where the blade goes in, that is actually a very good fit for a sword in this price range, or honestly a sword in pretty much any price range. They did a very good job fitting the blade to the guard here. And when I'm cutting with this sword, we'll get to more about cutting with it obviously later, but when I'm cutting with it, this sword rings very, very loudly. And that's typically a sign of solid hilt construction. That's a little surprising to me in a sword that features a hex nut construction because, things can come loose pretty easily, and especially in budget swords. Well, this one, with how much it rings, it is definitely fit very well and put together very, very well. All right, the grip. So this is not the original leather wrap. This is one of the most important customizations I had done to this sword. I will see if I can dig up a picture of what the original grip looked like on this sword. I did find a couple pictures, but unfortunately they don't really show the problems. Still, this is the best I was able to come up with. It was atrocious. The leather was thick and had a really terrible feel to it. But besides that, the seam on the grip, it was not joined properly. One edge was sticking up completely over the other edge of the leather, and it made a very prominent and bad hot spot. It was not a comfortable sword to handle at all. I didn't ever even cut with it. It didn't have a good enough edge to cut with originally either. I'll get to that later. But I would never have even wanted to cut with it because it would have torn up my hands, frankly. That leather was awful. So that's why I had Matthew Cross rewrap the grip on here, because I thought this sword, I guess I felt like this sword had potential and it was being let down by the really, really poor grip. So Matthew Cross did this grip. I believe this would cost $100 or $150 from him to rewrap it. I will have to double check that, and I will put it up on screen to make sure that I get the right price. And he did an outstanding job. His grip wraps are on the level of Albion or Valiant Armory, in my opinion. Everything is perfectly crisp, perfectly done. The transitions are absolutely beautiful. The riser work, just gorgeous, and it feels so good in the hands now. Now, because the leather is a little bit thinner than the leather that was originally on here, it has slimmed the grip down a little bit, and it's just there where it's good for me. If this were any thinner, I think that I would start considering this to be too small of a grip. But as is now, I love it. And you can see that if I really grip it and try to twist the sword, absolutely no twisting at all. That's a testament both to the leather work, but also the shaping of the grip, which is actually really good. The wood core in here is shaped really, really nicely. It doesn't have any flat planes on it. It's elliptical in shape, and it just works really, really well. It's wider. than it is thick, much wider than it is thick. Doesn't really have any thickness taper, maybe a little bit right up here, but the width does taper a little bit in towards the pommel. Not a whole lot. It's a pretty subtle profile, but the shape just works. It's a very comfortable sword to hold now that it has a proper grip wrap on it. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So the first thing I want to talk about is the thickness and the distal taper on this sword. It starts at a whopping 6.8 millimeters thick. And I say whopping because that's quite thick for this type of sword to start at. Oftentimes, these earlier medieval swords with a long fuller and a lenticular or hexagonal cross section, they'll oftentimes start between 4.5 to 5.5 millimeters. So averaging around 5, but there's plenty that start even thinner than that. 6.8 is thick for this type of sword. And Angus Trim swords, his earlier medieval swords, do tend to have more rigidity than a lot of swords of that type. It's one of the reasons his swords have a different feel to cutting with them than maybe ones that are a little more representative of the standard sword of that type. That's not to say this is wrong, it's just his specific style. So starts at 6.8 millimeters thick, has a very even distal taper all the way out, and then right towards the tip, it's ending at about 3.3 millimeters. So there's a good amount of distal taper here. It does stay a little bit thicker than I was expecting, especially when you consider that oftentimes lenticular cross-section swords get quite thin out here in order to optimize their ability to cut. Well, at the center of percussion, this one is still over 4 millimeters. So it's a little bit beefy of a sword, but it works. It handles well. We'll get into more of that later. The blade starts with these kind of flared shoulders. They're pretty subtle here, but they are here, and it's something I really like to see. I know Gus has this on a decent number of his swords, so it's not surprising he added it here too. It just gives a little bit more something interesting to look at the blade, and just looks nice. I like the way those flared shoulders look, and I'm happy to see it on here. The overall profile of the sword says big. It's wide, and it has profile taper, but it's not a lot. It's very evenly tapering down until it gets to the ogive curve at the tip. But there is some profile taper, not a lot. But overall, it's a very iconic look. This is very much a powerful cutting sword look to it, and I think it looks really good. Now, it did have a secondary bevel when I got it out of the box, but that bevel that sharpness wasn't very sharp. I'll get into that more later. The bevel was pretty evenly straight all the way through, but not at a particularly great angle. Not as bad as some swords from Kingston Arms that I've heard. Scabbard reviewed their Type 14, and the edge angle on there was awful. Well, this one it's not nearly that bad when I got it, and it's been refined further. The finish on the sword is a very even satin with grind lines visible, but the really nice thing about this is the grind lines are pretty much perfectly straight all the way down the blade. I don't see really any waviness or errant grind lines or anything like that. It's a very even finish that actually looks very, very nice. It's not the same finish that you'll see on a lot of Hanwei's medieval swords, which have a very distinct look to them. This has a bit more of a traditional satin polish that I think looks really good. Looking down the lengths of the blade, I do see some rippling here. It's very even rippling and consistent throughout, and not thick or deep ripples. It's very minor rippling. It's something that, with more work could be improved, but at this price point, I don't expect it to be improved. The fullers are also very well done, straight, even, and terminate at pretty much the exact same point on both sides. They look really, really nice here. The tip, because there's a secondary bevel there, It doesn't have quite as much symmetry as you would like to see, but it's well done and looks attractive enough to my eye. Overall, I think the blade on this sword is actually really, really attractive and just really exemplifies what a Type 13A sword is meant to look like, in my opinion. Let's take a look at the sharpness on some paper. Now keep in mind, this is not the default edge. This was sharpened by Matthew Cross. Before he sharpened it, when it had the default edge, it was completely unable to cut paper. And in fact, even if I inserted the sword and kind of drew it through, it still basically tore. It didn't really cut paper at all. So cut in very nicely there. The tearing down here is because I completely scooped that. It looks like there might be a little bit less sharpness right around here, but that's not a big deal. This is the ideal cutting spot. So it is very, very easy to get that edge right through the paper. Let's try the other edge now. So it did a nice slice, and then as it started getting back towards here, it didn't do quite as much of cutting. So it looks to me like what Matthew did when sharpening this is really focused to get it really nice and sharp right up here in the primary cutting portion, and then didn't do quite as much sharpening back here where it's still sharp. It's just not quite as sharp as up here. And for me, that makes sense. With a sword, one of the reasons you want it to be sharp all the way is because there's a lot of stuff with binding and winding, the way the edge works. Plus, you know, if you flub your cut and end up hitting here, you still want it to do something. You still want it to cut, but you really want to deliver your cuts out here. So it's good that it is still sharp down this way, but it's even better that it's really, really sharp up here. I think that's a good design of sharpness. Moving on to cutting. Now, I did not do any cutting with this sword before I had Matthew Cross sharpen it, both because the grip wrap was so bad, but also because the edge was just not sharp enough. I knew I was not going to enjoy cutting it. Matthew Cross put a very good and effective edge on it, and this sword cut better than any sword I have ever cut with. Why is that? Well, if in my last video I said that there were 3 things that I consider important when judging how well the sword cuts, what makes for a good cut. First one is technique, second one is sharpness, third one is blade geometry, in descending order of importance. There's one more thing that I did kind of forget to add, and that is just how well the sword fits the person. Not every sword is right for every person. And what's interesting to me is I would never have guessed that this sword was this right for me, but I get better cuts with this sword than any other one that I have used that I can remember at least. It cuts through water bottles with ease. It cuts through paper bottles with ease. It cuts through tatami with ease. It is just an outstanding cutter and easy to move around too. I'm gushing here because I've had just outstanding results cutting with this sword. Now, part of that, almost assuredly, is the fact that I am improving my technique. I may be a bit of a slow learner, but I do improve over time. And this sword is aiding me in that, the really good sharpness, the geometry of the blade that is very much focused on cutting and cutting performance. Those things, while they can't make up for bad technique, they can certainly make mediocre technique look good. They can make bad technique look maybe mediocre. They can make good technique look outstanding. You know, you get the point. This sword does that for me. Wherever you want to put my technique as, it makes it look better because I can't believe how good I cut with this sword on every target I put in front of it. It is an absolute joy to cut with in the state it's in now. Now let's talk about handling with this sword. And the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that I'm actually not going to do any comparisons to this sword in this video because I don't really have any that are good comparisons to it. I have an Crown Forge XIIIa, which is pretty decent comparison, but what I say about that sword isn't really going to mean much to you in comparison to this one because it's not available. It's a one-off piece. But what I can say is that in my recent Albion Baron review, I did compare this sword to the Baron. So if you want to see what I think of this sword in comparison to that, go ahead and check out that video. I'll put a link up here and I will try to timestamp it to where I bring up this sword. Don't know if that's going to work, but I'll try. In terms of how this sword handles, I want to talk first about my first impressions with it, and then I will get into some more detailed thoughts on how I feel about it now. When I first picked this sword up, I was like, whoa, that has a lot of weight out towards the tip. I did not expect that, being a Gus Trim design, which are, his swords are usually very agile, and this did not feel particularly agile to me when I first picked it up. And I was just kind of moving it around. I was like, wow, that is a lot of weight out here. I don't know that I like that. I'm not sure I'm going to like this sword. And I was like, wow, there's so much weight. What's the distal taper like on this? It feels like there's not a lot of distal taper out here. Well, I got my calipers out and did some very rudimentary measurements at that time. I was like, no, the distal taper looks good. I don't remember what those were, and I haven't done my detailed measurements on this yet, but my recollection is that the distal taper is very good. And just looking at it, I can definitely see it gets a lot thinner out here than from right here. So, and you've already seen the measurements at this point in the video, so you know that the distal taper is what it is. So that was my first impression on it. And I also weighed it at the time and took the point of balance. It is 3 pounds, 4 ounces, just under 1,500 grams. And the point of balance that looks like around 5.5 inches, maybe right around there. So it definitely has a good forward feel. But the way I feel about it now that I've used it more, now that it has a vastly improved grip, it's definitely got authority in the cut. This is not a particularly nimble sword. It's not going to be particularly great for multi-cuts because once you get it moving, it's not particularly quick to switch to another cut. It's not slow, it's not clunky, it's powerful, it's authoritative. It has a lot of weight behind the entire swing, but at the same time, it's not particularly heavy. 30 pounds, 4 ounces is not a heavy longsword. It is pretty much normal. It's heavy for a Angus Trim design sword, but that's not to say it's bad. It's not poorly designed. It's not blade heavy. It is blade heavy. It has a lot of weight in the blade, and you feel that, but it doesn't feel wrong. It feels like it's designed to be a powerful cutter. And if we look at the flex here, this is something that is pretty unique to Gus Trim style swords. This type of sword is usually going to be pretty flexible. Not crazy flexible, but pretty flexible. But this is very stiff. And yeah, not a lot of flex to it. Center of percussion right around here. So yeah, this is a well-designed sword, but it's not typical for what I think of as an Angus Trim design. But that doesn't mean it's bad. And this is something that just happened now when I was testing the flexibility of the sword. I mentioned that the pommel is a hex nut assembly. It is now very, very slightly loose. I can move the pommel a tiny bit, but that's not a problem. All I have to do is get an Allen wrench, tighten it right back up, and it'll be right as rain. So it's not a problem. I just figured I noticed it now. I'd let you know about it. And when I'm moving this sword around, you know, I really didn't expect to like it. I tend to like more agile swords. This sword has really started to win me over in just the way it cuts, the way it handles, when I'm holding it out here now, it doesn't feel as tip heavy as I thought it would feel. Just picking it up and slightly moving it, it's like, oh, yeah, that's got tip weight. But once I swing with authority, and that's not even full power or anything even remotely resembling full power, when I actually swing it, it's like, oh, that actually does feel right. That's not hard to stop like I thought it was going to be. It works. It works very, very well. Trying to get sword wind out of it. At least I can definitely hear that sword wind there. It's not particularly loud, but it's not quiet either. So that's a good training tool. And just quickly, I have no intention of swinging this one-handed. I'm not saying it can't be. I think there are people that would be able to use this one-handed no problem. However, I have a little bit of arthritis in my wrist and in one of my fingers that is more noticeable when I swing one-handed. So with this amount of power and weight and authority out here, it's just not going to feel comfortable for me to use one-handed at all. Like I said, I am confident there are people that it would not be a problem for, although this does really feel two-handed by design. So overall, while this sword has power and authority, there's a very real sense of intentionality to the design. To me, it feels like it was designed to have that power in it while still affording the ability to stop the cut where you want it to, stop it pretty easily into long point, and just a lot of intentionality. It feels like it was designed to be a powerful sword, a big-time cutter, not particularly nimble, but not incredibly clunky either. Angus Trim knows what he's doing when he designs swords. There is no doubt about that, and I can sense that intention behind this design, and it works. So what are some areas that Kingston Arms could improve on this sword? Well, I've got two things I want to point out. One of them very big, one of them not as big, but still something that I think should be improved. The big improvement would be the original grip wrap. It was awful. It was uncomfortable to use. The leather felt terrible. The seam was an incredible hot spot. It just was an unpleasant to handle sword with that original leather wrap. And it detracted from this sword a lot. And the other would be the sharpness. It was not incredibly dull out of the box, but it was not sharp enough to do its job, at least not well. In the hands of an outstanding cutter, it probably still would have cut decently, but that's more a matter of the skill of the wielder than it is the sword doing its job. With a better edge, this sword would be a better buy. All right, bottom line, this sword retails for $310, but this sword is not that sword. This one has an additional $250 of work added into it. The grip rewrap is a $150 value. The sharpening is a $100 value. I'm going to just get it right out of the way up front. I absolutely think Matthew Cross's grip rewraps are worth the price, and his sharpening is worth the price. If you're on the fence about having him do that for you, you don't need to be. He does outstanding work. I highly recommend it. I do need to caveat that Matthew is a friend of mine. So if I have some bias there, at least you know that. But I think you can see from the cutting footage and from the close-ups and everything that his work is actually quite good. So I have to really consider this sword as it sits in front of me a $560 sword. That makes it a tougher call than if this sword in this configuration was $310. So let me talk about it at $560, and then I'll talk about it at $310 before the customizations as well. So at $560, this is getting into a price range that I consider to be mid-range, but there's not really swords that compete with this sword in that price range. I can't really think of any other sword particularly like this in that price range except Albion's Squire line greatsword. I don't remember the exact name of it, but I think it's around $600 to $650. I don't know the exact price because of the recent price hikes, but it's in this general price range, and that's unsharpened. So that's really the only other sword I can think of that is really comparable to this sword in this price. And the fact that I'm comparing it to an Albion, even an Albion Squire line, should tell you a lot. And I will just come out and say it. Yes, I think this sword is worth the $310 plus $250 that I have invested in it. This is a monster cutter, a sword that I did not really expect to like nearly as much as I do. My initial plan once I got it back from Matthew was, all right, I'm going to review this sword and then I'm probably going to move it on because it's not really my area of collecting interest. I much prefer later medieval swords. I've talked about that plenty. But oh my God, when I got this out there and started cutting with it, it changed my mind completely. I love cutting with this sword. I love using this sword. It has surprised the hell out of me how much it's made me enjoy this sword. So the question is it worth that $560? Yes. If you are able to do the grip rewrap and the sharpening yourself, then this is a bargain for you because you can just save that money and do it yourself. But let's dial the praise back a moment and talk about it at the $310 price without the customizations. And I kind of mentioned what I thought of it just a moment ago. If you can customize it yourself, if you can put a decent wrap on it, if you can get it to a good sharpness, absolutely it's worth that price if you're willing to put in that effort. But if you're just looking for a sword to take into the backyard and have fun with and not have to put anything extra into it, I can't recommend this sword. I don't think it comes complete per se. The grip on mine was atrocious. The edge was just not sharp enough to cut with. It just was lacking in a few very critical areas. You know, the grip is where you interface with the sword. It's where your hands are. And for there to be a problem with that, it kind of detracts a huge amount from the sword. And I think the grip on this sword was so bad that I wasn't even willing to take it out and try cutting with it, even with the poor edge, because it tore up my hands. That ledge from the seam was sharp and unpleasant, and the leather didn't feel very good either. So I don't think I can really recommend this sword at $310 unless you plan on putting more time or money into it to refine it and get a good grip on it, get it up to nicely sharp. But if you can do that, if you're willing to put in the work, or if you're willing to pay for it, holy crap, is this sword worth it? It's got the skeleton of an outstanding sword. It just needs additional work to get there. And that's going to wrap up this review. I want to say it's been really nice to get back into reviewing budget swords again. For a while there, I was doing nothing but basically Albions and one Sterling Armory. And while I love reviewing those swords, don't get me wrong, I also do really enjoy reviewing much more budget-oriented stuff because I know a large number of people, that's what their market is. That's what they want to see. So for you, I've got a lot of budget swords coming up for review. I have one more high-end sword coming in about a month, and then nothing but budget-oriented swords all the way into September. So keep an eye out for all those. Make sure you're subscribed, hit the like button, leave a comment, do all that stuff. Until next time, Alien Toot out.